There is a notebook in the bottom drawer of my dresser that I have not opened in 3 years. It is small, the size of a paperback, with a cover the color of dried hibiscus, and the spine has gone soft from handling. I know exactly what is written on every page without looking. I know the handwriting changes halfway through, mine loosening as I grew comfortable, his tightening as he grew careful. I have thought about burning it. I have thought about mailing it to him with no note. Instead, I have done nothing, which I have come to understand was the pattern of the whole relationship, mine and his both, though it took me a long time and a great deal of quiet to see my own part in it. I want to tell you when he decided I wasn't in his future. That is the question I carried for 2 years after he left, turning it over the way you turn a coin in your pocket until the copper wears smooth. I used to think there was a single moment, a phone call, a hallway conversation, some hour I could locate on a calendar and say, there, that is when it happened. That is when he closed the door on me without telling me he'd done it. I don't think that anymore. I think it happens slowly, in the way a tide goes out, so gradually you don't notice the shoreline has changed until you look down and your feet are standing on sand that used to be underwater. But I am getting ahead of the story, and my daughter, she is not my daughter, she is my niece, Adaeze, but she has lived with me since she was 19 and she might as well be my daughter. My niece tells me I always do this, start in the middle, because the middle is where the ache lives. So let me start where it actually starts. On a Tuesday in September, in a cafe on Awolowo Road with peeling green shutters, where Kunle told me he'd gotten the offer. I had known Kunle for 4 years by then. We met at a wedding in Ikoyi, the kind where the aso ebi color is a very specific shade of teal, and everyone spends more time discussing the jollof than the vows. He was the groom's cousin, seated 2 chairs down from me, and he spent the entire reception drawing little diagrams on his napkin, explaining why the DJ's transitions were, in his words, structurally dishonest. I did not understand what he meant. I still don't, entirely. But I remember laughing so hard I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to fix my eyeliner. And when I came back, he had saved my seat by putting his jacket on it. And something about that small, unremarkable gesture felt like being chosen. We dated for a year before either of us said the word love. And it was Kunle who said it first, on a Thursday, over nothing. We were sitting in traffic on 3rd Mainland Bridge, the sun doing that orange thing it does over the lagoon. And he just said it, like he was reading off a receipt. I love you, Ijeoma. I remember being so surprised I said, okay, before I caught myself, and he laughed until he had to pull over. That was Kunle. He rarely announced the important things. They arrived sideways, dropped into ordinary moments like coins into a jar, and you only noticed the weight of them later, when you tried to lift the jar and found it heavier than you expected. By the 3rd year, we were talking about a life. Not in the abstract way people talk about someday. We were specific. We had the notebook. It had been my idea, actually, bought on a whim from a stationer near Yaba because I liked the color, and one night over suya and cold maltina on my balcony, Kunle picked it up and said, we should write down where we're going. Not just talk about it, write it, so it's real. So we wrote it. Toronto, first, because his older brother lived there and had been telling him for years to come build something in tech. Then a smaller list beneath it, an apartment with a proper kitchen, because I loved to cook, and Lagos apartments rarely gave you room to breathe over a stove. A dog, some ridiculous breed he'd seen in a documentary, a wedding small enough that my mother wouldn't try to invite her entire church. Children, eventually, though we were vague there, the way young people are vague about things too large to hold in the hand. I filled half the early pages. My handwriting, round and hopeful, listing restaurants we wanted to try in whatever city we landed in, a running joke about the specific shade of blue I wanted for a kitchen we did not yet have. His handwriting came in later, sparser, more like notes to himself than a shared dream. I didn't notice that shift while it was happening. You rarely do. You only see it when you go back with new eyes. The email came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were our slow days. No gym, no family obligations, just the 2 of us and whatever takeout we could agree on. He called me at work, which he never did, and his voice had a pitch I hadn't heard from him before. High and quick, like a boy who'd just won something at school and needed someone to be proud of him immediately. I got it, he said. Ije, I got it. I didn't need him to explain. He'd been interviewing with the Toronto firm for 3 months, a role that would let him do the kind of engineering work Lagos couldn't offer him yet. Not at that level, not with that pay, not with that visa sponsorship attached to it like a golden thread. I felt my whole chest lift. When do you start? I asked, already doing math in my head. Visa timelines, my own job, whether Adiaze could manage the flat alone if I left, how long engagements typically took when one party was already living in another country. January, he said. They want me there by January. 4 months. It felt both enormous and impossibly small. That night we celebrated at the cafe on Awolowo Road, the one with the peeling shutters, because it was where we'd had our first real conversation about the future, back when future was still a word that included both of us without qualification. He ordered suya, and I ordered jollof. I barely touched because I couldn't stop watching his face, lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. Maybe longer, though I wouldn't let myself think that thought all the way through yet. This changes everything, he said, and I agreed, though I understand now that we meant different things by everything. I need to tell you about the weeks that followed, because this is where the dual truth of the story lives. The Kunle who held my hand across that cafe table, so genuinely happy, so genuinely in love with me in whatever way he was capable of loving, and the Kunle who was already, without fully admitting it to himself, drawing a map that did not have my name on it. I don't say this to make him a villain. If there is one thing I've learned in the years since, sitting with my own hurt long enough that it stopped burning and started teaching, it is that Kunle was not a man who lied to me. He was a man who could not bear to disappoint anyone, including himself. And so when a truth became inconvenient, he simply did not look at it. He let it sit in a room he didn't enter. I think, in his mind, if he never said the difficult thing out loud, it hadn't fully happened yet. The first crack, though I didn't recognize it as a crack at the time, came 2 weeks after the offer, when we sat down to talk about the visa. Spousal sponsorship is different from what my brother did, he said, scrolling through some immigration forum on his laptop, brow furrowed in the way it got when he was working through a problem that had no clean answer. It takes longer if we're not married. If we were married, it would be faster. So we get married, I said. I meant it lightly, but also I meant it entirely. We had, after all, written it in the notebook. A wedding small enough that my mother wouldn't try to invite her entire church. He laughed, but the laugh had an edge to it I didn't examine closely enough. It's not that simple, IJ. My parents would want the full thing. Your mother would want the full thing. We can't just go to a registry in 6 weeks. I'm not saying 6 weeks. I'm saying, we know we're doing this. We could start. Let me get settled first, he said. Let me get through probation. Get a proper apartment. And then we do it right. I don't want our wedding to be a visa formality. You deserve better than a rushed thing. It was, on its surface, a reasonable and even a loving thing to say. I want to be honest about that, because so much of what unravels a relationship is not cruelty but reasonableness. Statements so sensible sounding you cannot argue with them, even as some old, animal part of you senses that something underneath the words does not match what is on top of them. I let it go. That was my pattern too, if I am telling this story honestly. I let a great many things go in those months, because I did not want to be the woman who made her boyfriend's dream job into a referendum on our relationship. I did not want to be small. I did not want to need reassurance so badly that I extracted it from him like a tax. So the visa conversation became, he would go first, on a work permit, and I would follow later, once we'd sorted out the logistics. That word, logistics, became a kind of curtain he drew over anything he didn't want to look at directly. October brought the embassy visits, though only his. I sat in the car outside the Canadian High Commission on Victoria Island 3 separate times, keeping him company, buying him suya from the vendor near the gate afterward, listening to him recount every question the visa officer had asked. I remember how alive he was during those weeks. Not the alive of a man building a life with someone, but the alive of a man on the edge of a great personal reinvention. I told myself I was part of that reinvention. I told myself the notebook made it so. It was Adiaze who first said the thing I wasn't ready to hear. Has he mentioned when you're supposed to visit? Or when he's applying for you? She asked one evening, doing her homework at my kitchen table while I made dinner. in the kind of casual tone young people use when they are testing whether an adult is ready for a hard question. He said after he's settled, I told her. It makes sense. He needs stable income, a lease in his own name, all of that, before he can sponsor anyone. Okay, she said, and went back to her textbook. But she said okay, the way I had once said okay to Kunle's I love you, surprised, and covering the surprise, and I noticed it, even as I refused to let myself sit with it. My mother was less subtle. She had never fully trusted Kunle, not because of anything he'd done, but because of a suspicion she carried about men in general, and ambitious men in particular. That ambition, left unchecked, has a way of becoming the only love a person is capable of. He has a plan, she told me over the phone. Make sure you're in the plan, Ijeoma, and not just in the memory of the plan. I didn't understand what she meant then. I understand it painfully well now. November was the month the notebook started to change. I noticed it without noticing it. The way you notice weather shifting before you consciously register that summer is over. We used to write in it together on Sunday evenings, adding small things, a restaurant name he'd read about, a photo we wanted to recreate somewhere in the world, a joke about the ridiculous dog breed. In November, I opened it one evening to add an entry, a line about a Portuguese custard tart place I'd seen online that I wanted us to find once we were both there, and I noticed the last several entries were only in his handwriting, and they were not about us. Apartment viewing, Liberty Village, Tuesday. Ask about health benefits start date. Call brother Re. Furniture storage. Small, practical, forward-moving lines. Nothing sinister, nothing that screamed betrayal, but there was no us in them. No ask about spousal visa timeline. No fine two-bedroom, not one. Just a man building a life, in a notebook we had built together to hold a life for two. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself I was being paranoid, that logistics come before sentiment sometimes, that a man securing an apartment is not a man abandoning a relationship. I wrote my custard tart line beneath his practical ones, my round handwriting looking suddenly, absurdly young next to his clipped, forward-facing script, and I closed the notebook and did not open it again for 3 weeks. The unease did not arrive as a single blow. It arrived the way humidity arrives before rain, a thickness in the air you feel on your skin before you see a single cloud. I began noticing things I had trained myself not to notice. The way he answered, "We'll figure it out," to nearly every question about my timeline, a phrase so soft and so evasive it could mean anything, which is precisely its function. The way he talked about the apartment he was renting, 1 bedroom, for now, with a comfort that didn't sound temporary. The way, when his mother asked at Sunday lunch whether I would be joining him soon, he answered for both of us with a smile that did not reach his eyes. God's timing, mummy. God's timing. A phrase so perfectly Nigerian, in its ability to defer a question indefinitely, that even I, sitting right there, could not object without seeming to argue with faith itself. I confronted him once, gently, in December, 3 weeks before he was due to fly out. We were lying in my bed, the ceiling fan turning lazily above us, his arm heavy across my waist in the specific way it always was when he felt safest, and I asked, into the dark, "Kunle, when you picture your life there, a year from now, am I in it?" He was quiet long enough that I felt the question land somewhere he hadn't wanted it to. "Of course you are," he said. "Why would you even ask me that?" "Because you never say it. You say we'll figure it out. You never say when Ijeoma comes. You say we'll see." He pulled me closer, which I understand now was not an answer but a substitute for one, a way of using the body to quiet a question the mind did not want to face. "I'm not good at talking about the future like it's already decided," he said. "I don't want to promise something and then have life get in the way and disappoint you. I'd rather show you than say it." It was, again, a reasonable-sounding sentence. It is only in retrospect that I understand reasonable-sounding sentences can be a very effective way of never actually answering the question that was asked. I let it go, again. I want to be honest that this was my choice as much as it was his avoidance. 2 people, each protecting themselves from a conversation neither wanted to have, mistaking the absence of conflict for the presence of peace. The week before he left was full of a strange, aching sweetness. We went to all our places, the cafe with the peeling shutters, the suya spot near his old flat, the beach at Elagushi where we'd had our first real fight 2 years earlier over something so small neither of us could remember it by the time we made up. We took photographs. We laughed. There were entire hours where I forgot to be afraid, where I let myself simply love him the way I had for 4 years, without the low hum of unease underneath it. On our last night, we sat on my balcony with the notebook between us, and he wrote something new. Something that made my chest loosen with relief when I read it upside down as he wrote, Toronto, then EJ, then everything else. I remember crying, actually crying, from the relief of it, and he kissed my forehead and said, "See, I told you, just trust me." I flew that promise like a flag for the entire month of January. I did not know yet that a man can write a promise in a notebook with his whole heart in the moment he writes it and still, months later, quietly stop believing it himself, without ever crossing it out. I have thought a great deal, in the years since, about that final entry, Toronto, then Asia, then everything else, and whether it was a lie. I don't believe it was, not in the moment he wrote it. I believe Kunle meant it entirely, the way you mean a New Year's resolution on the last night of December, with your whole chest, before the ordinary friction of daily life starts sanding it down to something smaller. That is the particular cruelty of avoidance as a way of hurting someone. It rarely begins as deception. It begins as hope that curdles slowly under the weight of a life a person is too afraid to examine honestly. Kunle did not decide, on any single day, that I was not in his future. I have come to believe, instead, that his future simply grew without me in it, month by month, the way a garden grows around a stone, until one day you look, and the stone has vanished into the shape of the earth. And no one can say exactly when it happened, only that it did. But I am ahead of myself again. In January, I did not know any of this. In January, I stood at the departure gate at Murtala Muhammad International Airport, holding a man I loved, believing, with the particular fullness of a heart that has decided not to look too closely at its own doubts, that I was watching the beginning of our story, not the end of one that had already, quietly, stopped being about two people. He turned back once before the gate and waved and mouthed something I couldn't hear over the noise of the terminal, and I told myself it was "I love you," and perhaps it was. I have never been able to decide whether that matters. The first month, distance felt like a texture we could manage, even a texture that flattered us. We spoke every day, sometimes twice. His morning was my afternoon, his evening my very late night, and I learned to love the strange arithmetic of loving someone 6 time zones away. He sent me photographs of snow, which he found endlessly, almost childishly delightful. Snow on the mailbox, snow on his boots, snow collecting in the seams of a coat he'd bought at a shop near his new apartment. I sent him photographs of Lagos heat, of Adaeze rolling her eyes at something on television, of the notebook still sitting on my dresser, its hibiscus cover slightly warped from the humidity he no longer had to live inside. "I miss the heat," he told me once, in February, in a voice that had already started to sound different. Not unkind, just further away, the way a voice sounds when the person speaking it has begun to build a life whose textures you cannot fully picture. It's strange. I used to complain about it every day, and now I actually miss it. "You could come back," I said, half joking. "Don't tempt me," he said, and laughed. And I laughed too, and neither of us examined the small, cold seed of truth sitting underneath the joke, that a man who missed home and stayed away anyway was choosing something over that home, and I needed to understand what, exactly, he was choosing, and whether I was inside it. I want to pause here and speak from where I am now, years past that February, because this is a memoir and not simply a chronicle, and a memoir owes its reader the wisdom the narrator didn't have at the time. I understand now that distance does not create distance, it reveals it. The 6,000 kilometers between Lagos and Toronto did not manufacture the gap that grew between Kunle and me. It simply removed all the ordinary intimacies that had been disguising a gap that already existed. In person, a held hand can paper over an unanswered question. A shared meal can stand in for a shared vision. But over video calls, stripped of touch, stripped of the daily choreography of two bodies moving through a life together, You are left with nothing but words. And words, it turns out, are where Kunle was weakest. He had always loved me best through gesture. The jacket saved on a chair, the arm heavy across my waist, the notebook filled in Sunday evening quiet. Ask him to build a future purely out of language, spoken plainly across a screen, and he faltered in ways I had never seen him falter before, because gesture had let him avoid, for 4 years, ever having to say a difficult thing directly. Canada did not change Kunle. It simply removed the room he'd been avoiding, and left him standing in the doorway of it, with nowhere else to go. March brought the first real fracture, though even now I hesitate to call it a fight, because it didn't sound like one. It sounded, at the time, like a perfectly civil conversation about paperwork. I had started, quietly, researching the spousal sponsorship process myself, reading forums, calling a Lagos-based immigration consultant a friend had recommended, trying to understand what would actually be required of us if we did what we'd always said we'd do. I brought it to Kunle on a Sunday call, notes in hand, feeling almost proud of the work I'd done. So if we did a court wedding in the next few months, I said, even something small, just registry, we could start the sponsorship paperwork by summer. The consultant said processing is usually 8 to 12 months from there. So realistically, I could be with you by next spring. There was a pause on the call, not long, perhaps 4 seconds, but long enough that I felt it in my stomach before he said anything at all. That's a lot to take in on a Sunday, he said, and laughed, but it wasn't his real laugh. I've just been doing the math, I said. We always said this was the plan. It is the plan, he said. I haven't even fully settled here myself. I'm still learning the job. I don't have real savings yet. I don't want to bring you into a life that isn't stable. I don't need it to be perfect. I need it to be ours. It will be ours. I just need time. I asked him, then, the question I had been circling for months without ever landing on directly. How much time? Kunle. Give me a number. A season. Anything. The silence that followed was the longest one of the entire relationship. I remember watching his face on the screen, slightly pixelated, his eyes somewhere off camera, and I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that he did not have a number because he had never let himself sit down and choose one, not because he didn't want me there. I want to be precise about this, because it is the heart of the whole story. Not because he didn't want me, but because choosing a number meant confronting a version of his life where I was a fixed, unavoidable variable, and some part of him, a part he had not yet admitted to himself, was not ready to make that variable permanent. I don't know, he finally said. I don't want to lie to you and give you a date I can't keep. It was, I told myself that night, an honest answer. It took me another 8 months to understand that it was also, in its own way, the truest sentence he ever said to me, and that I had not yet learned how to hear the whole of it. I called my mother after that conversation, something I rarely did about my relationship, because I had spent 4 years defending Kunle to a woman who had never fully trusted him. He said he doesn't want to lie to me, I told her, expecting her to soften. She was quiet for a moment. That's not honesty, Ijeoma, she said finally. That's a man who already knows the answer and doesn't want to say it out loud, because saying it makes it real, and not saying it lets him keep being the good man in his own story a little longer. I was angry at her for saying it. I told her she didn't know him the way I did, that she had decided who he was before she'd ever really tried to know him. She let me be angry. She did not push. She only said, before we hung up, I'm not trying to be right, my dear. I'm trying to make sure that whatever happens, you don't lose yourself waiting for a man to decide something he should have decided a long time ago. I did not understand, at the time, how much I needed to hear that sentence, or how many more months I would spend not listening to it. Spring in Lagos is not a season so much as a held breath before the rains, and that is exactly how those months felt, held. I kept working. I kept my life moving in the ways a life must keep moving. Dinners with Adeze, deadlines at the marketing firm where I'd been for 6 years, Sunday church with my mother, who had stopped mentioning Kunle by name and started referring to him only as your young man, a phrase that had begun, subtly, to sound less like affection and more like a diagnosis. Kunle and I still spoke daily, though the calls grew shorter, and increasingly filled with the small talk of two people managing a relationship rather than building one. How was your day? What did you eat? Did you see this video I sent you? I told myself this was normal, that all long-distance relationships eventually settle into rhythm rather than intensity, that intensity is not the same thing as love, and its absence is not the same thing as its ending. I opened the notebook again in April, on an evening when the power had gone out and I was sitting by candlelight with nothing else to do with my restlessness. I read through it slowly, start to finish, for the first time in months, and I saw, really saw, in a way I had been protecting myself from seeing, the shape of what had happened to it. The early pages were a duet, my handwriting and his, twined together, sometimes finishing each other's sentences on the page the way we used to finish each other's sentences out loud. Restaurants. The absurd dog. The specific blue for a kitchen. Somewhere around the middle, I could locate it almost to the week, right around the time the offer letter arrived. The duet became a solo. My entries kept coming, hopeful, forward-looking, filling in details of a life I still believed we were building together. His entries became shorter, sparser, and then, finally, entirely practical. Furniture. Deadlines. Logistics with no us attached to them. And there, near the end, was the line he'd written our last night together. Toronto, then EJ, then everything else. And for the first time, reading it by candlelight, I noticed something I had missed in the emotion of that evening. He had written it beneath a line of his own from 2 weeks earlier, one I had read at the time and let slide past me without weight. Talk to Ife about roommate situation if things don't work out as planned. Ifeanyi was his co-worker, a fellow Nigerian he'd mentioned a handful of times, someone he was becoming close to in Toronto. I sat with that sentence for a long time in the candlelight. If things don't work out as planned. Which plan? I wondered. The plan where I joined him? Or a plan he had never fully said out loud, even to himself, that involved a different shape of life entirely, one with roommates and independence, and a future he had not yet decided how to phrase to me. I did not confront him about it, not yet. I want to be honest about why. I was afraid. Not of him, exactly, but of what confronting it might force into the light. As long as I did not ask the question directly, I could still tell myself a version of the story, where the answer was still undecided, still open, still possibly in my favor. Asking meant risking an answer I could not unhear. This, I understand now, was my own avoidance, mirroring his. We were, in the end, two people equally unwilling to face a truth neither of us wanted, just for different reasons and in different directions. I have made my peace with my part in that. It took longer than I wish it had. The unraveling, when it finally came, did not arrive as a single dramatic scene. It arrived in May, in pieces, the way bad weather arrives. First a wrongness in the light, then a wind that changes direction, and only then, finally, the rain. It began with a photograph Kunle posted, on a platform I rarely checked but happened to open that evening out of idle boredom, a picture from a work event, a rooftop somewhere in Toronto, a group of colleagues laughing at something outside the frame. He was in the photo, mid-laugh, a beer in hand, and standing close beside him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm in the casual way of people comfortable with each other, was a woman I didn't recognize. The caption was innocuous, something about a great team, a great year. I told myself it meant nothing. Physical proximity in a photograph is not evidence of anything. I have repeated this to myself many times since, and I still believe it's true. What unsettled me was not the photograph itself. It was that I hadn't known about the event at all. 6 months earlier, Kunle would have told me about a work rooftop gathering days in advance, complaining good-naturedly about having to make small talk with people from finance. Now I was learning about entire evenings of his life from a photograph posted publicly, learning about them the same way a stranger would. I asked him about it, gently, that night. Looked like a fun night. Who's that with you in the group shot? Oh, that's Amaka. She's on my team. She's actually Nigerian too. Small world, he said, easily, without hesitation, in a tone that gave me no reason for alarm, and yet somehow did not entirely put me at ease either. The whole team went out for someone's promotion. You didn't mention it. Didn't think it was worth mentioning, honestly. It was just a work thing. It was, on the surface, a completely reasonable answer. But I noticed, with a discomfort I couldn't fully name, that didn't think it was worth mentioning had become his answer to an increasing number of things. A work trip to Montreal, a weekend hike with colleagues, small slices of a life accumulating in Toronto that I was learning about after the fact, if I learned about them at all. It was not that any single omission was significant. It was that the sum of them had begun to describe a life with a shape I could no longer fully see, lived by a man who had, without ever deciding to, stopped narrating his days to me in real time. I did not accuse him of anything with Amaka, because I genuinely do not, even now, believe there was anything to accuse him of in the way that word usually means. This is not a story about infidelity in the way that word gets used in the dramas Kunle's own culture loves to tell about itself. This is a quieter, sadder story about a man who was slowly, unconsciously, building a life that had room in it for new people, new routines, new rhythms, and simply had not built enough room, or made the deliberate choice to build room, for the woman who was supposed to be its center. By June, I had started to understand something I did not yet have language for, though I would find the language later, in therapy, in conversations with my mother, in slow nights of writing in a different notebook, this one entirely my own. I understood that Kunle had not betrayed me with a lie. He had betrayed me with an absence of decision, an absence of the difficult conversation, an absence of the number I had asked for in March and never received. And I understood, with a clarity that arrived slowly and then all at once, the way truth often does, that his unwillingness to give me an answer was, itself, the answer. I called him on a Tuesday, our old slow day, though it no longer meant anything to either of us across the time difference, and I asked him the question directly, finally, without softening it. Do you still see a future with me in it, Kunle? Not someday, not eventually. Right now, when you picture your life a year from today, am I actually in the picture, or am I something you're still hoping to figure out how to include? The silence lasted longer than the one in March. I let it last. I did not fill it, though every instinct in me wanted to soften the question, add an escape hatch, give him a version of it he could answer easily. I had spent a year giving him easy versions of hard questions. I made myself stop. I don't know how to answer that without hurting you, he finally said. That's an answer, I told him, and I understood as I said it that it was. He started to say something else, an apology or an explanation. I never fully found out which, because I told him, gently, that I needed to go, and I ended the call, and I sat on my balcony in the dark for a long time, and I did not cry, not right away. The crying came later, in waves, over the following weeks, the way grief does when it isn't given a single funeral to organize itself around but has to be carried in pieces, in ordinary moments, making tea, folding laundry, hearing a song we used to like on the radio in a taxi. But that night, on the balcony, what I mostly felt was something quieter than heartbreak, something almost like relief, the specific relief of finally being told the truth about a question you had been too afraid to ask outright for a very long time. I had spent a year in the space between comfort and clarity, and though the clarity hurt more than the comfort ever had, it also, for the first time in months, felt like solid ground under my feet. We did not officially end things that week. That would come later, in July, in a conversation that was, in its own strange way, more honest and more tender than almost any conversation we'd had in the 2 years before it. A conversation I'll return to, because it matters, because it is where the story of him ends and the story of me, the one I actually want to tell, truly begins. But that Tuesday night in June was when I finally opened the notebook one last time before putting it away in the bottom drawer where it has stayed since, and I wrote, beneath his final entry, beneath Toronto, then EJ, then everything else, a single line in my own hand, the last thing either of us would ever add to it. Some plans only ever belong to one person. I am learning the difference between waiting and disappearing. I did not show it to him. It was not written for him. It was, I understand now, the first sentence of the rest of my life, though I did not yet know how far that life would take me, or how much of myself I would find waiting on the other side of losing him. The final conversation happened on a video call in July, and I want to describe it exactly as it was, because I have heard so many stories, from friends, from strangers online, from the dramas everyone in my family loves to watch on Sunday afternoons, where the ending arrives in shouting, in accusation, in one person storming out of a frame. Ours was not like that. It was quiet and slow, and in its own way, it was the most honest either of us had been in a year. "I think I've known for a while that I haven't been fair to you," Kunle said, early in the call, before I had said almost anything at all. His face on the screen looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not from lack of sleep, but from the specific exhaustion of a person who has finally stopped outrunning something. "I kept telling myself I'd figure out how to make room for you once things settled, and then things would settle, and I still wouldn't do it. And I think somewhere along the way, without ever deciding it on purpose, I built a life here that I got comfortable in. And I never went back and asked myself hard enough whether you actually fit into what I was building, because asking that question meant I might have to change what I was building, or admit that I didn't want to." I did not interrupt him. I let him say the whole of it, because I understood, even as he was saying it, that this was the conversation I had been waiting a year to have, arriving finally, too late to save anything, but not too late to matter. "I'm not seeing anyone else," he added, quickly, as though he could feel the shape of my next question forming. "It was never that. Amaka is just a friend. Genuinely. That's not what this is. I think if it were something simple like that, it would almost be easier, because then I could just say, I did something wrong, and be sorry for it. This is harder to be sorry for, because I don't think I did one wrong thing. I think I did 100 small nothings, over and over, and all of them added up to you not being here. You could have just told me you weren't sure," I said. "Months ago. A year ago. I would have been devastated, but I would have had my life back a year sooner." "I know," he said. "I think I told myself that if I didn't say it out loud, it wasn't fully true yet. Like the not saying was protecting both of us, but it wasn't protecting you. It was just protecting me from having to be the one who ended something good, because some part of it really was good, Ijeoma. I don't want you to walk away from this thinking none of it was real." I sat with that for a long moment. Outside my window, the Lagos evening was doing its ordinary, loud, alive thing. Okada horns, someone's generator 2 compounds over, a hawker's call drifting up from the street. Life continuing, indifferent to the private ending happening inside my 4 walls. "It was real," I said, finally. "That's actually the hardest part. If it hadn't been real, this would be so much simpler." We talked for almost 2 hours that night, longer than we had in months, and for the first time since January, it did not feel like 2 people managing a distance. It felt like 2 people finally standing in the same room, even across an ocean, even through a screen, telling each other the truth. He told me things I hadn't known. That he had, in fact, gone as far as looking into the sponsorship paperwork on his own in the spring, and then closed the tab and never opened it again, because filling it out felt like a promise he wasn't sure, in his most honest moments, that he could keep. That he had rehearsed more than once, telling me directly that he didn't know if he wanted the same future we'd written in the notebook anymore, and had lost his nerve every single time, because he could not bear to be the one who broke something I still believed in so completely. "You asked me once when I decided you weren't in my future," he said, near the end of the call, and I realized, with a small jolt, that I had never actually asked him that question out loud, only carried it silently, for months, the central unanswered question of the whole relationship. He must have felt me asking it anyway, in all the ways it had shaped our conversations without ever being spoken. "I don't think there was a day," he continued. "I wish I could give you one, because then at least it would make sense as a story. I think it was never one decision. I think it was 1,000 times I chose not to decide, and somewhere in all that avoiding, the decision just sort of made itself, without either of us really choosing it on purpose. It was, I understood even then, the truest and most complete answer he was ever going to give me, and it was, in its own painful way, enough. Not because it made the loss hurt less, but because it finally let the loss have a shape. I had spent a year grieving something without contours, an ambiguous, shapeless ache that I could not fully name or finish. That night, for the first time, my grief had an edge to it, a beginning and, however imperfectly, an end. and I found that I could hold something with edges far more steadily than I had ever been able to hold the fog that came before it. We said goodbye gently. There was no cruelty in it, no final cutting words, only the particular tenderness of two people releasing something they had both, in their own ways, loved honestly, even if not well enough, even if not completely. I did not hate him when the call ended. I want to say that clearly, because I know this is not the ending some people want from a story like this. They want the villain punished, the door slammed, the righteous fury. I did not have fury in me that night. I had grief, and underneath the grief, something that felt almost like the beginning of relief, the way a fever breaking feels like relief, even as your body still aches from having carried it. The months that followed were not a montage of instant transformation, and I want to resist telling them that way, because that is not how healing actually happens, and I promised myself, sitting down to write this, that I would not lie to make the story tidier than the truth. I did not wake up the next morning radiant and whole. I cried in the shower more times than I can count. I deleted, and then reinstalled, and then deleted again, an app where I could see when he was active, a small humiliating ritual I am not proud of but will not pretend I didn't do. I ate too little for 2 weeks and then too much for 2 more. Adieze made me tea I didn't drink and sat with me on the balcony on nights I didn't want to talk, which, it turns out, was its own kind of talking. What I did have, that I hadn't fully had before, was clarity. And clarity is a strange, sturdy thing to build on, even when it arrives dressed as heartbreak. I stopped waiting for a phone call that would rearrange my life around someone else's decision. I stopped, slowly, checking a notebook for evidence of my own worth. I started, instead, to ask myself questions I had spent the last year asking only of Kunle. What did I want? Not eventually, not once things settled, but now, in this life, in this body, in this city that had raised me, and that I had never actually left, even in my imagination, without him. I found, to my quiet surprise, that Lagos had never stopped being enough. I had spent a year imagining my future as a place I had to be transported to, a city I hadn't yet earned the right to call mine, because the man I loved was building his life somewhere else. When that future dissolved, I discovered that the ground under my feet, the actual ground, the traffic and the heat and the noise and the fierce, particular tenderness of my own family, had been waiting for me the whole time, patient, unbothered by whether I had noticed it. My mother did not say I told you so, which I had half expected and fully deserved. Instead, on the Sunday after the final call, she made my favorite soup, the one with the specific bitter leaf she always says I don't appreciate enough, and she sat across from me at her small kitchen table and said only, "You are allowed to grieve something and still know it wasn't the right thing for you. Both can be true. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you it has to be one or the other." I have carried that sentence with me since more than almost anything else anyone said to me that year. I want to tell you about the notebook one more time, because it is where I began this story and it is, in its own quiet way, where it ends. Nearly a year after that final call, in a season of my life that had begun, tentatively, to feel like my own again, I took a trip. My first solo trip anywhere, a decision that terrified me for weeks before I made it, and felt entirely ordinary within about 6 hours of arriving. Not Toronto. Cape Town, a city I had wanted to see long before I had ever met Kunle, one that had never made it into our notebook because it had never been his dream, only mine, quietly set aside for years the way we set aside our own wants when we've convinced ourselves someone else's wants are the more important architecture to build a life around. I stood on a beach outside the city on my last evening there, the ocean doing something gold and enormous in the last light, and I understood, standing there entirely by my own choosing, in a place I had chosen entirely for myself, that I had spent 4 years measuring my future by the size of someone else's ambition, mistaking the borrowing of his dream for the building of my own. It was not his fault, not entirely. I had let him hold the pen for both of us, for longer than I should have, because it had felt, for a long time, easier than picking it up myself. When I came home, I bought a new notebook, not to replace the old one, which I have not thrown away and do not think I ever will, but to begin something separate, entirely mine. The cover is a deep green, the color of the ocean that evening. I have filled several pages already, in handwriting that has grown, month by month, steadier and more certain. The way I imagine his must have grown careful, and clipped in the months he was quietly building a life without me in it. Except my pages have no gap in them, no shift halfway through from duet to solo, because there was never a second voice to lose. There is only mine, and it turns out that has been enough to build something real. I do not know, even now, if Kunle ever opens the old notebook when he thinks of me, or if he even kept his copy of that season, or if it sits in some drawer in a Toronto apartment I will never see, gathering its own quiet dust. I have made my peace with not knowing. Some doors, I have learned, do not need to be closed by someone else's hand. You can simply stop standing in the doorway and walk on, and let the door be whatever it becomes without you. The question I carried for so long, when did he truly decide I no longer belonged in his future, no longer feels like the right question to have spent a year of my life on. I understand now that it was never really the question that mattered. The question that mattered, the one I only learned to ask myself in the quiet after the ending, was simpler and harder and infinitely more useful. When will I decide, for myself, what belongs in mine? I decided on a beach in Cape Town, with the ocean going gold in front of me and no one's hand in mine but my own. I have been deciding it, in smaller and larger ways, every day since. That, I have come to believe, is not the sad ending it might have seemed to be in July, on that quiet call, when I thought I was only losing something. It was, though I could not see it yet, the exact moment I began, finally and entirely, to find myself.